La deuxième journée qui va commencer, elle est sous le double signe de
Today, we're going to be talking about cultural entrepreneurship, and this is what we're going to be talking about now with our guests. And then later on this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the role of, or the place given to, or the place that isn't given to, culture in the construction of cities of the future. You know that today we're talking a lot about intelligent cities, smart cities, and cities of the future. So how can we design or conceptualize our cities for the next 10, 15, 20, or 50, or even 100 years? So we are very forward-thinking about this, and we wanted to think about this issue, and we wanted to try and reflect on whether cultural innovation really does have a role to play in this construction of our cities, or is this a secondary value? Is it something that's taken into account today in the thinking which is currently being conducted by local authorities amongst other stakeholders? So I'm going to hand over to the moderator, who is Philippe Silberzahn from EM Lyon Management School. So you'll see that we've created some links with some higher education institutions. We have a big partnership with EM Lyon, and Philippe's going to explain this. And also we have certain guests who I will let him introduce. But I'd particularly like to say hello to Stephen Hearn, who is honouring us with his presence here today. I won't hide that we are accustomed to working together because we do share the same commitment to a place called Lyrique in Paris. This isn't why we've invited him today. We've invited him today to talk about future perspectives and to talk about the notion of cultural entrepreneurship because he will explain that he's been commissioned by the Ministry of Culture to think about the specific issue. So I'm going to hand over, and I wish you a very constructive conference, and for those of you who are staying till the end of the week, I hope you enjoy it. And then I'm going to hand over to Philippe Silberzahn, who I'd like to thank for moderating. Thank you. Hello. I'm very happy to welcome you this afternoon for this session on reinventing cultural businesses, or the cultural enterprise and cultural entrepreneurship in the broader sense of the term. So I'm not going to speak very much today. I'd just like to say a few words. So I am a professor at EM Lyon Management School. Before this, I had a real job as an entrepreneur, as a businessman. So I do know the field of entrepreneurship, not cultural entrepreneurship, but business I know very well. So we speak the same language. And also I'm involved in a new course which has just been created in partnership between EM Lyon and the engineering school called Centrale, which is called IDEA, which is innovation, design, entrepreneurship and art. So you can see that there is a link with the European labs and the Sònar. Now, reinventing the cultural enterprise or cultural industries is the subject that we have to discuss today. It's an important subject for two reasons. First of all, because cultural industries are currently undergoing some sweeping changes, and we talked a lot about that earlier on already, but the causes and the factors which are causing these changes are multifarious. Obviously, we have internet, and there's not one single cultural industry which hasn't been changed by the arrival of internet, but there's another factor of change that we're going to talk a lot about, which is the cuts in public funding, which means that we're going to have to renew our model, and we are renewing our models and ways of working. So obviously people don't necessarily understand that this is always the case, but this is the way it is. And also cultural industries are important for a second reason, which is the fact that that today there's no industry per se that doesn't need to renew itself and to update itself. So cultural industries are a model that we can draw inspiration from with new practices of innovation, creation, and the way they work. So in addition to the role model that cultural industries play, we think about how cultural industries can, in fact, be a model for entrepreneurship in the broader sense of the term in this economic context, which is not very favourable right now, and that's the least we can say. So we have to think about the role that these cultural industries can play, and the role played by creation, in innovation, and in the renewal of our industrial fabric, and also in reinventing new industries, and so on and so forth. So these are the subjects that we're going to be discussing this afternoon, and to do that, so we have an interesting panel of guests. The idea is to talk with people who are already involved in this kind of rationale, either from France or abroad. So we have Stephen Hearn, who you probably know already, who is commissioned by who has been commissioned by the Ministry of Culture to think about these different developments, and we've asked him to open this session, first of all by giving us a presentation of his background, and he's got a very interesting background which I think is symptomatic of what cultural industries are becoming nowadays. And secondly, we asked him to say a few words about the state of progress of his work for the Ministry of Culture. So Stephen is going to start with that. And then we're going to listen to Todd from the US, who comes from the South by Southwest Festival. And here again, I think we're going to have a very interesting insight on the origin of this festival and also the way it works. And then we have Julien Catal, who is the founder of Super, which organizes a series of different festivals, which you might know as well. And Giorgio Taglietti, who comes from the Sònar Festival in Barcelona, and who, here again, I think has a lot of interesting things to say. So to start off with, we'll start with Stephen Hearn, who I'm going to hand over to without further ado. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't know all of you. Everyone said you knew me, but no, I don't know all of you. So I'd like to start by thanking this European Lab for Innovation. Don't forget, we are governed by the tout bon law. We have to say everything in French, so I'm glad that I can speak in French. So I'd like to thank you for that. And also, I'd like to thank the organizer of this festival, also the Senator and Mayor of Lyon, Gérard Collomb, for inviting me here. And it's very intimidating for me to have to talk about reinventing cultural enterprises here. I'm going to talk about reinventing, maybe. It was a bit of a wager to talk about this subject. There's culture and business, cultural businesses, culture and money, art. I'm not sure if all of these things necessarily go together. And very often in France, I've heard that the two terms, in fact, were mutually opposed, and that culture and economic issues and issues related to capital and talking about entrepreneurship in the cultural field, it's not necessarily that evident. You know that culture tends to be subsidized, and a lot of people say that culture doesn't need any directors or bosses apart from sponsors or mentors. Now, I'm going to talk about my background as a cultural entrepreneur, and I hope this will serve as an introduction to this mission that not only the Minister of Culture has given me, Aurélie Filipetti, but also Fleur, who is Delegate Minister for Industry and New Technologies. So I've taken a few notes. I don't want to digress too much, but I don't want to paraphrase Simone de Beauvoir saying that I wasn't born a cultural entrepreneur, but I've become a cultural entrepreneur over the years, and this is what I'm going to explain. It was despite myself, really, because, in fact, this is due to coincidental meetings. But these meetings have always had a common denominator, which I think are very important, which is cultural being culturally demanding, but also enthusiasm. So you have to be enthusiastic about what you do, want to transfer things, to work differently as well. I think really this is the start of what we might call innovation. Now, I really do believe in businesses, and this doesn't necessarily mean that I don't believe in the voluntary sector or the subsidized sector either, but I think there is a specific arena which has a corollary with entrepreneurship, which is where we can meet, exchange, and co-construct and do things together, but without necessarily losing sight of our objectives, and which don't necessarily tend towards being profitable, but at least breaking even. And so also I was going to talk a little bit about power struggles, economic power struggles. I'm not necessarily one for the race for profits, and obviously this is something that explains why people think there's this opposition between culture and the business world. And it's true, we have to think about this other opposition, which is the opposition between the virtual and the real world. So This is something which is rather overwhelming when working in this world. And now I think a company has to be a militant activist. I think a company should create social and economic balance, and also a company should be cultural. So I'd also like to say that I like to create open and innovative systems where possible. So I think innovation has to be used. It shouldn't just be based on technology or techniques. Also, I believe in generous systems which are beneficial to all, and systems which enable us to develop different examples. There are examples of diversity, for example. Diversity is really the main purpose of culture, and I think this is something which enables us to move away from our very inward-looking attitude, even if there are a lot of people that I cooperate with, and a lot of people who are involved in culture. So I think diversity is all important, and this is really at the foundation of everything I do. Now, I'd like to apologize in advance, because this might seem very narcissistic of me, but I want to describe my own personal background because I think it might be interesting to you. And I tend to favor practice rather than theory, but nonetheless, I want to talk about what I have done, and I want to walk the talk, if you like. So I don't necessarily I've not necessarily put words to my career in the past, so it's an interesting exercise for me. Now, I have a dual background, so I did a business school, but also I studied philosophy and history of art, and before I became a businessman, I was an employee, so I've had bosses in my past, and also I installed works of art in public spaces. I organised conferences on bioethics, I've communicated for NGOs, and for me, really, the turning point came when I worked for a communication agency where I discovered late on in the day that the majority shareholder and the director subsidized an anti-abortion league, and this really annoyed me. And in fact, it was something that apparently people are having a hard time hearing me. Is it better like that? Let me start. Hello, my name is... They've all fallen asleep in the room because nobody could hear me. Anyway, because I think this is the graveyard slot after lunch where everybody is sleeping and digesting. Anyway, for me, I decided to set up my own company, and it was a political choice. It wasn't really an entrepreneurial choice. It's just my way of working, really. So I set up what I call a cultural engineering company. So the idea was to mix together three professions which weren't necessarily mixed, study, communication and innovation. So the second feature of this company is I think I use different methodologies from the cultural world but also from the social sciences world, and we were the ones that started to provide the first service to support our artists who were on the minimum wage and who now benefit from other forms of allowance. And we worked exclusively for local authorities, and I have a lot of references, in fact. Let me mention some of these references. And for example, La Production de Nuit Blanche, the Non-Magnétique Festival, which will start next week, and also another show, and the show for the Mobile Pompidou Center, which is another example of cultural democracy, because in fact it's a show where we travel around different regions of France with several works of art from the Pompidou Center. Also, we've worked for the Louvre Museum and so many other examples. But what's interesting in this type of thing is that the project actually worked. It's not necessarily interesting in itself, but the fact is that we were able to multiply our sales by a factor of 10 in less than 5 years, and it's the net margin of this agency which enabled us to start funding, self-funding all of the future stakes that we took in other companies before we started to organize things differently, but I'll explain that later on. So we have more than 20 employees who have open-ended contracts, and this is very important for me because we have to have a particularly sustainable human resources policy. I don't want people with too much turnover and people leaving all the time, so this is why we need permanent staff with a real group. It enables us to have a really close-knit group, which is what I call a commando group. So, in fact, I've delegated the management of this agency to a younger colleague, and when I say younger, she's the same age as when I created the agency, but it's not necessarily easy to transmit companies. You don't have to keep them and fight until death to keep your companies. It's important to know when to transmit, and I transmitted to a woman, and also somebody who's more intelligent than me. When I say more intelligent, it's not necessarily true, but somebody who's very smart and has a very clever way of working and is very aware of the current ways of working and who's very aware of territorial issues and digital issues and cultural issues. And I consider myself to be part of the old generation, even if I wear sneakers. Now, we have developed considerably over the years, but I was quite frustrated when I created this agency, and I'll talk about this later on, because it's very frustrating to be a consultant and to dictate to people what they should do and not do yourself. So this is what I find difficult, and this is why I decided maybe to move into more business. And Vincent was talking about this earlier on. One triggering moment was when in a magazine in 2004 I cut out an announcement for a public service delegation for a specific mission for Paris. So I remember that I cut out that announcement from the newspaper, and then I put it in my pocket of my trousers, and then it got wet in the washing machine. But nonetheless, I took it out of the washing machine, and I did decide to respond to that announcement. And the city of Paris said that my application was rather interesting, but I didn't have much experience for anything else, which is probably a bit of a quality as well, the fact that you don't have much experience. And in fact, I didn't get discouraged by this, and we decided that we were going to construct a long-term application for the city of Paris, and this enabled me to, in the meantime, grow the agency, which is an applicant to work on this project for the city of Paris. And as the project, the public service delegation project, was based on the idea that the local authority was going to entrust to a private company something which is a public service. So that's what's behind this idea of delegation of public service. So normally the City of Paris should be responsible for this, but it has to delegate this service to a private company. And basically you have to think about what public service actually is, how you can make that cultural activity profitable, and so on and so forth. So all of this costs money, obviously. And I had to work with certain partners, and one of the clever tricks that we used to win the deal, or to clinch the deal, was that we bought a stake in the operating company, and in fact the partner which was going to manage the maintenance of the building was this company. And in fact this was a service invoiced at 1 million euros, and this enabled us to reinvest this money later on into the artistic activities of our agency, the Troisième Pôle. And this is one example of a patronage operation which can be very beneficial. So you have what we call skills patronage. I hope everybody knows the Lyrique building. It's a building which is dedicated to digital arts. It's more than 10,000 square meters, and it works with a budget of about 10 million euros. So this was the project, this building, which would house concerts, exhibitions, and also we decided that we wanted to build a place which was very user-friendly, but also a place which had a business incubator so as to encourage the startup of new startup companies. So I defend cultural companies, and I say that cultural companies should have intelligent dialogue with local authorities and optimize all cultural activities so as to make sure these cultural activities are as profitable as possible, or balanced as possible from a financial standpoint. And the fact that we won the contract to build this building and to manage this building was very beneficial for us, even if I'm in charge of a press group called La Revue Vivante, which is committed to cultural activities and which does a lot of work on sustainable development and things like this. Also, I contacted a press company called Troisième, which is involved in communication for les nuits sonores, also reggae vibes. And Serge was another review or another magazine in France which no longer exists, so it's a former magazine. We created an advertising agency called Culture Régie, and we joined forces with Julien for the management of Trebendo, which he deals with, and you'll hear about that later on, and also D3 Digital, which is a film company. So this is the type of development that I've been involved in. So you can see that I've joined forces with a lot of different people, and this is the sort of thing I'll continue doing in the future. And further to a meeting in a cafe, I met the son of a cinema owner, and I had a discussion with him, and a few weeks later he offered me to buy an equal stake with him to manage the cinema hall, and that's how I took a stake in the cinema hall as well. So later on as well, I was contacted by Henri Simons and Edouard Meyer, who's in the room here actually, and they asked me to be president of a cinema in Brussels, which is called the Cinéma des Galeries, which in turn opened a concept store and also an exhibition hall of 10,000 square meters, which is dedicated to moving image and the film industry. So all of these things are the fruit of various encounters, and all of these companies have been juxtaposed, and not everybody was working together across these different companies, but also I have another associate called Olivier Sabi, and we decided to organize this and to bring all of these stakes together in the form of a holding company, which we called Scintillo, and which is not necessarily very visible, but grouping these companies together and these activities together has enabled us to clear things up and to clear up the administration and the human resources management. And we hope that in this way we're going to be able to work in a more intelligent manner, and we're going to do a bit of tax optimization as such. Now, I say this jokingly, but tax optimization is something which enables you to free up some margin and therefore to hire more people. Not necessarily many people, but nonetheless, it's very positive. So this group, this cultural group, Scintillo, this cultural ecosystem now has 135 fixed jobs and combined sales of more than 24 million euros exclusive of tax. So thanks to this intimate knowledge of these business models and these different companies and these ecosystems, which are sometimes very specific, and we too are trying to invent some new ecosystems and new ways of working. So it's thanks to this experience that gradually we've been able to build up our own vision of cultural entrepreneurship. Now, it's true that we feel quite isolated in this field because it's not very frequent to have this type of organization. And even in the vocabulary that we use and the values we defend, not everybody understands this vocabulary and these values. We have a lot of interaction with politicians who don't necessarily see this very positively and don't necessarily see the autonomy of cultural stakeholders very positively, because culture is something which is usually highly subsidized, and also financial backers who tend to see patronage as a way of getting around paying tax. And however, I think this is really the main way of working in the cultural sector. So we try and co-construct everything we do, but reinventing cultural enterprises and reinventing our cultural enterprise, because this is really the case in my case. Culture for me is not a product. It's something which is much more complex than a product, and it's something which refers to the common good or to the commons. And the people who have, in fact, people who manage these companies have been marked by this different vision of culture as opposed to a product. Now, culture is based on an independent ecosystem, and we try and fight to defend cultural values in doing everything we do. So at the end of the day, things have worked quite well, and we have started thinking about why we couldn't share this expertise that we've built up and exchanging this expertise with other entrepreneurs or other people who wanted to start up businesses. So to do this, we've created two tools. The first tool is a business incubator, which we created 1 year ago, and we've doubled the size of the co-working space a year ago, and this has enabled us to incubate about 20 cultural companies. There's a bit of cookery in there, there's a bit of architecture, there's a bit of fashion in those companies as well, and this employs about 80 to 100 people, and this incubator hosts companies which are developing their own activities, and also we are there to support all of these startup companies with our expertise, and we have what we call cross-fertilization, so this enables people to pool their resources and also to act as a think tank, if you like. And when I say pool resources, it's also pool jobs. And these startup companies, in the space of a short period, less than a year, have been able to consolidate their own activity thanks to this incubator, and they've been able to consolidate about 30 full-time jobs as well. So if you inject resources into these companies, then it does work. The second tool we've created is a venture capital investment fund. So these are very financial words now, so it was impossible for us to imagine venture capital and the fact that venture capitalists could be interested in this type of venture. So we've now targeted 5 companies for which we're raising 2 million euros. And the idea is not necessarily, well, we've discussed this with a lot of people from here and there throughout this festival. The idea is not to demonstrate that culture is just one economy, but that culture can be a form of the economy or part of the economy. So we're not there to transform a model, even if it is based on resources from public authorities, and now we're in a situation of urgency because we have less resources. So the idea is not to replace one model by another model, but to optimize the model that currently exists. So our companies that we support modestly, we're only one of the 200,000 cultural companies in France. Now, these cultural companies are not very well known in France, but there are a hell of a lot of them. And sometimes they don't even know that other companies work in the same sector as they do. And depending on the definition that they have, they account for about 5 to 7% of the French GDP. So these cultural activities can be a source of competitiveness and growth for our country, and they account for about 1.4 million full-time equivalents, jobs. So at global level, obviously you can imagine the figures involved, and culture and creation account for somewhere between 3.3 and 3.5% of the European GDP, and it's somewhere between 7 to 8.5 million jobs. So it goes without saying that the cultural sector is a very important sector. Now, before the artistic and sector was seen to be a sector that was highly dependent on public subsidies, but for us it's been important to highlight that we do have entrepreneurs in the cultural sector, and the ministers, Philippe Silberzahn and Fleur Pellerin, wanted to do this alongside us, and this is why we were entrusted with this mission to think and to make recommendations on this notion, which I still think is a bit blurred, since we only learn what this notion is all about when we study it. So for those of you who have followed this, and for those of you who went to the entrepreneurship assizes, whose conclusions were welcomed wholeheartedly by the French ministers.
So you're telling me I need to hurry up? So the conclusions of the report were raised a lot of attention, and in both the cultural, innovation, and SME sectors, this raised quite a few issues. And so a lot of background work had to be done here, and we've used this as something of a guidebook on how to create a cultural enterprise. Now, this is not yet a well identified notion, I'd have to say. there have been many different governments have said, yes, keep up the good work, guys, keep going, but, we have to learn as we go. And what we can say today is that, we are well underway. The governments are sitting up and paying attention to the value of these enterprises. And we certainly welcome criticisms. Okay, don't insult us, please, but suggestions, recommendations. We have a website where we welcome suggestions and ideas about what we're doing. So some of the first observations we can make about this economy, the cultural enterprise, out of those 200,000 businesses, most of them are very small businesses, maybe 60%. Some of them are very technologically oriented. And the business model of these businesses is often a lot of prototype or setup, launch type work, and and a lot of the traditional financing is coming from subsidies. It's difficult for them to obtain risk capital, seed capital. So, as the anonymous group was saying, we are legion. So we probably need to pool our forces a bit more to work together to promote our contribution to the economy. And it's interesting to see that the ministries are perhaps not suited to the way we work, have not understood the way we work. And so this does create additional obstacles for cultural businesses. So we have to get everyone talking about the same thing, on the same page, so that we can really learn to work better together to promote projects. And there's a study underway, in fact, on cultural GDP. And so, yes, it would indeed be important to get a better notion of this. So that's a part of what we work on together. Now, what we're trying to do in my organization is to come up with recommendations for the public authorities in particular. And so one of the first questions we need to ask is, do the laws need to be adapted on the status of cultural industries? Can they receive subsidies? Normally, subsidies are reserved for associations. So then there's also tax incentives. What can be changed or adapted there? Then there's various support organizations for, if you look at European guarantee funds, bank loan guarantees, tax credits. There are many things which other types of businesses currently benefit from, but which cultural enterprises have difficulty obtaining. So we need to find ways to make that happen. Then also there's the entrepreneurial aspects that need to be worked on. We need to find ways to create clusters, to improve the professionalism of some of the people who start these businesses, and learning how to win public contracts as well. So, and sometimes it's hard for the smaller companies to obtain these because they're seen as being too small. And it's not necessarily an important thing to have a bigger company to do the job. We need to find ways, as I said, to facilitate access to seed capital, venture capital, better access to new technologies as well. So all of those points have been raised with the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of the Economy. There has to be a better recognition of what I call the cultural risk. There's the immaterial aspects of culture, which are misunderstood. We have to find ways as well to encourage employment, and it's not always easy, for example, for people working in the cultural industry to work in other countries. So we have to facilitate the movement of culture workers. And so I was saying, in this study, we will be reaching out to cultural businesses, and Scintillo, mission at scintillo.eu is our website that we'll be using to conduct this survey and study of what's going on. Now, so as I said, though I consider myself a cultural entrepreneur, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, although as we all know, cultural budgets are melting, as we would say, like ice cubes in the sun. It's disappearing. So, but I don't want to be too pessimistic about that. So this is why we think that sponsorship and patronage and subsidies can no longer be the sole solution. And what we see is that the success of certain business enterprises means finding new types of partnerships. And there will have to be something of a reinvention of the cultural enterprise. So we have to better understand the business side of all of this. Even though, sometimes it's, business is made to sound like a dirty word. If we look at the Opera House and the Philharmonic Orchestra, those things are not viable businesses, and nobody wants to hear talk of doing away with them, but probably some tough questions need to be asked. And we believe that the cultural enterprise does set out a path forward in this completely changed economic environment. And for the future. Thank you.
Merci. Alors, je note le langage à la fois très managérial et en même temps.
So there was a very managerial vocabulary there. At the same time, very focused on culture.
On va continuer.
And now,
on va passer en anglais.
We'd like to hear from Todd.
Donc, je vais demander à Todd.
And Todd, so I'd like to ask you to please say a few words then. Sorry, we're moving some equipment here, excuse me. So, Todd, if you could quickly introduce South by Southwest, tell us a bit about the background with it, what's specific and original about that festival, and in its economic model, the environment which it was, and any difficulties you've encountered. And if there's any connection with what Stephen has told us, tell us if you agree, disagree, or what are some of the possibilities. And you've got, a little over 10 minutes, so there's your challenge for you. But then we'll come back with more. J'espère que tout le monde m'entend bien. Donc, Todd Puckaber du festival South by Southwest et nous entrons dans notre 27e année. C'est basé dans le Texas, à Austin. Nous avons 2300 groupes qui sont présents, 100 000 personnes qui assistent à toutes sortes d'activités. Donc, on a également des activités pédagogiques, la musique, du spectacle, du cinéma. C'est vrai que on commence avec une idée, une bonne idée et une passion pour cette idée. Pour moi, c'était vraiment ma passion pour la musique. Mes parents étaient déjà dans les arts du spectacle et dans mon adolescence, c'était très fort pour moi. J'essayais d'aller à tous les concerts possibles et c'était voir un super spectacle. Pour moi, c'était important. Donc, pour moi, c'était l'une des meilleures choses de la vie, c'était d'aller voir des concerts. Et donc, si moi, maintenant, je peux proposer des bons spectacles aux gens, pour moi, c'est un grand plaisir. Donc, South by Southwest a commencé avec des spectacles en outdoor, donc en plein air. Et c'était surtout de la musique au début. Et la musique, c'est surtout le soir, mais pendant la journée. On a commencé à avoir des idées originales. Cela ne devait pas être juste un autre festival de musique. C'était un peu plus comme les nuits sonores, le concert la nuit, mais comment parler de l'industrie de la musique aussi pendant la journée. Donc, c'était un peu nos débuts. C'était pas que des groupes qui faisaient du spectacle, mais aussi travailler avec les groupes, les agents, la presse. Et qu'est-ce que ça apporte aux groupes qui viennent jouer. Donc, on avait 200 groupes dans un premier temps et maintenant, on a beaucoup étendu le champ des musiques et c'est devenu un monstre, si vous voulez, avec des tentaculaires et on essaie de s'accrocher. On en est très fiers, mais c'est vrai que c'est formidable quand les gens se réunissent, discutent avec différentes personnes, discuter de nouvelles idées pour le festival. C'est un défi en même temps. Et ce qui est bien dans notre festival, c'est qu'il y a toujours de nouvelles idées. Donc le festival interactif qu'on a ajouté il y a 10 ans, c'était un tout petit bout du festival. Et maintenant, c'est presque aussi grand, sinon plus grand que la partie concert. 25 000 personnes qui participent dans le festival interactif uniquement. Et donc, il y a une journée où ça se chevauche, où nous avons donc les agences, les entreprises de musique et web et autres qui viennent participer. Et c'est vrai parce que l'industrie a beaucoup évolué. On a vu disparaître des maisons de disques, on a vu disparaître des éditeurs variés et autres, alors que le côté web est en pleine expansion. Donc, avec South by Southwest, avec notre festival, on a su toujours rester vraiment à l'affût de ces évolutions. Et quand on a vu la musique traditionnelle, commencer à évoluer vers l'interactif, on a réussi à attirer ces différents publics sur un seul festival. Et pour la première fois cette année, on avait également un forum d'entreprise, un forum professionnel aussi. Avant, on les séparait un petit peu. Ils étaient à différents moments du festival. Mais on a compris que souvent, les gens voulaient se parler, voulaient se retrouver ensemble. Donc ça, c'est bien passé. Donc, quand on voit European Innovation Lab ici à Lyon, c'est une idée, je vous encourage, parce que chez nous, en tout cas, ça nous a apporté énormément d'idées. Et aux États-Unis, je crois qu'on n'a pas de soutien des autorités publiques, on n'a pas de ministère quelconque. Bon, il y a quelques fondations, National Endowments for the Arts, mais bon, c'est souvent des dons privés. Et eux, c'est souvent des subventions qui vont vers certains types de concerts. Et South by Southwest est véritablement une entreprise. Nous sommes complètement seuls. On n'a jamais eu le moindre sou du secteur public, des autorités locales, du gouvernement. Bon, la ville d'Austin supporte certains coûts liés à la sécurité parce que c'est très difficile pour nous. Nous, on ne pourrait pas payer. Donc, il y a de l'aide maintenant, mais au début, on n'avait strictement pas d'aide. Nous sommes une entreprise privée qui a essayé de voler de ses propres ailes. Et donc, cela dépend énormément de l'idée de base et de la passion des gens qui y participent. Et si c'est une bonne idée, eh bien, on connaît le succès. Et sinon, c'est l'échec. Et bon, le capitalisme est fait ainsi. Les gens acceptent de payer pour des choses qu'ils trouvent intéressantes. Et si on a une bonne idée, les gens sont prêts. Et heureusement pour nous, on a connu le succès, car je pense que c'est grâce à notre capacité d'injecter de nouvelles idées, de faire des festivals satellites aussi. Par exemple, à Las Vegas, c'était né. Et ici, on réunit des entrepreneurs avec des fonds de capital risque aussi. C'est une nouvelle activité que nous avons développée et il y a déjà pas mal d'intérêt pour ce forum d'entrepreneurs, une sorte de speed dating des entrepreneurs et des fonds d'investissement. Donc, c'est aussi important pour nous. Et donc, ça fait partie d'une grande famille de South by Southwest. Où va l'industrie de la musique? D'où va venir l'argent? C'est une situation très complexe avec toute cette musique qu'on peut trouver gratuitement, si on cherche bien sur Internet, comment est-ce que les artistes peuvent être rémunérés? Grande question. Donc, c'est extrêmement difficile pour certains de survivre dans cet environnement-là. Et une bonne idée qu'on a eue aussi, c'est vraiment un festival pour montrer les nouveaux, les groupes émergents. Et ils ne sont souvent pas rémunérés et ils profitent. Pour eux, c'est intéressant de participer, pour se faire un nom, alors que d'autres viennent bien avec leur maison de disques et tous des grands noms. Et c'est vrai, c'est une sorte de... on réunit énormément de choses en même temps. Pour beaucoup de groupes, c'est intéressant de participer rien que pour ça. Spotify peut se présenter aussi leurs idées. Donc, on a eu toutes sortes d'entreprises et produits qui veulent mettre en avant leurs services, leur savoir-faire, leurs produits et nous parler des artistes qui produisent. Donc, ça attire l'attention et donc, ils espèrent en tirer quelque chose par la suite. Et donc, South by Southwest, pour eux, c'est vraiment le festival qui leur permet de se montrer. Bon, il y a beaucoup de choses comme ça. Pendant la nuit, pendant la journée, il y a des conférences comme ici, des tables rondes sur des thèmes. Un grand échange d'idées là qui est intéressant. Et voilà ce qu'on fait.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks for that, Todd. So, Julien, tell us a bit about your experience then and what's going on with you now. My name is Julien Catal. I'm 34 years old. And I began working in the music business in Dijon, organizing concerts. I think I was 16 when I organized my first concert. And I think I've pretty much always known that that's what I wanted to do, or that I was going to try to make it my job, my business. I did a cultural management certificate in Dijon. I did some very interesting internships. I learned a lot during that program, and at the same time I was continuing to organize concerts in Dijon. Then I worked at Café de la Danse, which is in the Paris Bastille area. I did that for 6 years, where I was participating in the programming. It was a small team, and we did a little bit of everything. And that was, I learned a great deal through that experience. I learned how the music industry works, the relations with the labels, the producers, managers, agents, etc. And at Café de la Danse, after that, I moved on to look at different types of performing arts. Animal Collective, José González, other artists such as that. And I particularly wanted to bring people that were little known in France. Often the foreigners who come here are really, are the top billing the big names. So I wanted to see about bringing in some smaller types of performers. And there are some agencies doing this in the UK, for example. Eat Your Own Ears, it's called. They produce concerts, they go on tour, but with a real artistic vision. Here, they're something of a live music label, and people have like what this agency develops and sort of trust them and go in readily willing, buy tickets without necessarily knowing even who's on the bill, just because they like what the agency does. So the idea is to produce concerts. That means taking a financial risk, renting the halls, etc. And so we produce all around France as well, not just in Paris. And so we want to be really want to develop a following for what we do. They know that we make good choices, interesting choices. So our agency has developed quite a bit, and in fact, the fact with the music industry collapsing in a way, I know it's a disaster in some senses, and for some people, for us, I have to say it worked in our favor, because people are, if they're buying fewer records, fewer CDs, well, they have more money to go to concerts, don't they? Or at least that's our idea. And so we produce, for example, Pitchfork Music Festival. Something that we've done recently. We organize about 900 concerts a year with about 200 different artists produced by us. So that's pretty much what I do. And so to develop our agency, which is called Super, I think it's also important to ensure, the business model. So we have to have, various side activities, perhaps own a hall ourselves, that type of thing, parallel activities, so that we are not just a booking agency, so that we have our fingers in different pies. And so as I said, we launched the Pitchfork Music Festival, so working with the American website Pitchfork, of contemporary music. And we do this at Villette, which is a fabulous place that you probably know outside of Paris. And so we've done, starts on the 31st of October for 3 days, 20,000 people in 3 days, which is pretty good for such an eclectic selection. We had Glizibert, other lesser, artists that aren't necessarily that well known, particularly in France. Last year, when we said we had 20,000 people, they said, "Oh, well, that's not enough. That's not going to work." But I think what really helped us here is that we have, we bring in quite a few foreign groups, and we get visitors coming from all over the place, Scandinavia, the U.S., Spain, who are coming not just to see the concerts, but to live this experience, which is the Pitchfork Festival. And, and in Paris, is a great place, so they'll organize, maybe a 4-day visit. They've got maybe 2 days for culture and 2 days for, for other visits and 2 days for our festival. And it's going pretty well so far. We have some new ideas to perhaps take it on the road to other European countries. Also, working with the hall called the Trabendo. That's 750 seats in the Vidette area of Paris as well. And I think I saw a call for projects a year or two ago at the Gaîté. The room belongs to the Ministry of Culture, in fact, and they were looking for a new project, someone to operate the hall. And we thought, well, with 750 seats, that's a good size for us. There's, it's in the middle of a park, so we don't have to worry about the neighborhood, because that can be a problem when you're trying to have. So there's a lot of things that we can do there. So I thought, well, we need to find a partner to help us do this. And I know some of the people at a magazine, Sugi. And so, I wrote to them and talked to them about my idea, and I asked if they wanted to work with me, and they were a bit skeptical in the beginning. But we met and talked about it, and we worked very hard to put together a proposal. About 3 months to put together a proposal. We had to come up with a budget, a 3-year budget, programming, the work, all of it. And I mean, and then there was a 7 or 8 month period, and we were lucky to win that call for projects, and we just opened a year ago. So for us, it's working quite well, and for our, for our agency, Super. It's great because we can use it for our own artists. We can also have artistic residencies as well, because otherwise that's something that would be very expensive. So now we have this hall available to us, and we can have artists come in and occupy the place for 10 days and develop a new show. It's a beautiful hall. The sound system is excellent. The acoustics are excellent. So, this is really a dream come true to be able to do what we want with this hall. So we're doing quite well. But if you look at the business model, we're totally private. We don't get any subsidies whatsoever. And for the festival side, I think it's we don't have volunteers. A lot of French festivals really depend a great deal on unpaid volunteers. Everyone is paid. Many are salaried. 200 people are employed during the festival. So, it's we're pretty proud of that, and no subsidies. And like I said, we're making money, so things are going well so far. And for the operating of the hall, it's the same thing, you know, it's the tickets, the bar, you know, the catering or whatever, we can make money on that.
Voilà en gros, donc la société existe depuis
and the company has now been in business for six years. We've got 4 million euros with 14 permanent staff. There you have it. Thank you.
Et donc, Georgia.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to hand over to Georgia. It's not easy to be the last person to speak. I've got ideas that I wanted to talk to you about. So I work for the Sònar Festival, which is in Barcelona, and not only in Barcelona actually, but the Mother Festival, as we call it, is in Barcelona. It's been held for the last 20 years, so we've had 20 editions. We will have our 20th anniversary this year, in fact. We started in 1994, and I started working at the festival in 1995. And when I started, there were 6 of us, and it was a festival that had about 6,000 visitors at the time for the first edition. And now it's a festival this year which we are expecting 100,000 visitors for. So for 3 days, so 13th, 14th, and 15th of June. So it's in 1 month's time. So I'm sorry if I might seem a bit elsewhere, because I've got a lot of things going on. So I remember when I started working in the field of music, and when the Sònar Festival was created, I remember seeing my father come, and he saw the company for the first time in 1996, and there were 6 of us at the time, and we didn't have any windows, and we were in this dark office, and my father said to me, "Are you sure you want to make money on this type of job?" And I said, "Dad, this is where I work, you know, I want to stay here." And he said, "Show me something solid." And we had a musical production studio, and I showed him this. He said, "Is this what you're going to make money with? Are you going to book visitors with this, etc.?" And I'm very happy 20 years later down the line to show my father what we've done. He's not here, to show him that we did succeed, and that things have developed considerably, and that culture is a way of living. It's not just musical production, but culture is something which is less tangible and less concrete. But there is some business, and it's an enormous business with a budget which this year will be 5,350,000 euros. So this is the biggest budget we've ever had, and I'll explain why this is the biggest budget we've ever had in a few instances, and 335,000 in public funding, which is a lot of the budget. Then private sponsoring, we have 948,000 euros. So this is about 17% of the total budget. And the independence of the budget is 4.6 million euros, basically, and this is 76.01% of the total budget, so self-funded. So this is very clear-cut, and the independence of our festival is very clear when I show you these figures. And the proportions haven't changed much over the years, to be quite honest, so we haven't really gained or lost anything, but since 2006, you know that we've lost a lot of private brands which weren't supporting the festival at more than 15 to 16%, at least in our case, because we've never had really naming support for our festival. So, you know, naming is a partnership with which you have where commercial brands, in fact, tend to be more important than your own brand. So we've never had that, except in Brazil with Nokia, which was an interesting partnership for us, because in fact this has changed a lot of things in the festival over there. But I think the worst thing that ever happened in our country, Spain, was the change in VAT, value-added tax, and this is something that's important to talk about because VAT on cultural products is 21%, in fact, and this has been the case over the last year, and this has really changed things considerably. So there's been an increase in VAT of, I think it's about 13% in VAT for cultural activities, and this was really a killer moment for everybody in the cinema industry, in the literature industry, and in the music industry. And it's important to talk about this type of thing because for us this has changed everything. It's changed everything. It's changed the price of entry, and people don't necessarily have the money to pay for this anymore because of the VAT rise. So this is a terrible situation, and this is something which affects us all in Spain, and it's really had a devastating effect on the cultural activity in Spain. And for me, it's been a true shock. I didn't ever think this would be possible when it was announced, but it has been brought in now, and we've seen the changes from one day to the next. And so this was on the 1st of September 2012 that this increase was brought in, and this has changed the way we work. It's changed our ticketing policy, and we've had to review all of our budgets because of this. Also, we've had to even rethink what our point of view of a promoter is, also independent workers who try to live and have to pay 21% on what they do. So this is something which has meant we've had to rethink our models, rethink our selling models, rethink our way of existing, if you like, on the cultural market, and we've had to rethink the way we think about industrial culture and industrial enterprises, because we're not competitive anymore because of this VAT, and you get the impression that everything you do in this market, which is suffering from an enormous crisis, that in fact we have even less resources now to actually try and do something with this limited budget we already had. So the Spanish authorities have said to us that everybody's having to cut their budgets, and access to culture is becoming increasingly difficult. But everybody should have access to culture, and this is something which is enshrined in the Spanish constitution. But the fact of increasing the VAT to 21%, which is the highest VAT rate in the whole of Europe, this is an enormous contradiction between the Spanish constitution and our cultural policy. Because don't forget that culture is not just about music products or books. Culture is all about people's way of understanding the world, and culture is important for everybody. So culture is much more than just a product. Culture affects everything we do. Culture is an enormous world. And one example which since we're talking about the US is crowdfunding. This is something we could use. Now, the concept of crowdfunding is something which leads to a decrease in the cost of access to culture for the public. So that's us, people like you and me, who invest money in producing cultural activities. So we should think about crowdfunding because there are some positive but negative aspects to crowdfunding as well. So also we have to think about public patronage. Before we didn't have public patronage for cultural activities, but now, unfortunately, this is replacing what cultural institutions should do, and this is more and more the case. So another very tangible example is the fact that online websites of institutions want to look more and more like private companies now. And they want to use the content that we produce, so the cultural content that people like you and me produce, and they want it. They want to simulate what we do, if you like. They want to want to try and be like us. And we have examples of situations where culture has worked, and but if you work in the cultural field, you have to have revenues as well. And we produce culture to show talents and show creation to people, but we have to survive as well. We shouldn't forget this. We have to be real enterprises, and we have to be real entrepreneurs.
Et le truc important pour moi à dire
what's important
aujourd'hui,
for me to say
c'est
today
que
is that
la situation c'est
the
encore pire dans les
situation
autres
is
pays.
even worse in other countries. Our situation is terrible, but the situation in Europe is extremely grave, and I think it's important to support us. And I think we have to be very committed to this. The fact that governments and public institutions don't understand this, they don't understand the digital change, the change in communication, the change in the content which has been brought about by the digital revolution. So we have to think about how culture is disseminated now, and also how the cultural content of what we do has changed, but public institutions are not aware of this, and public institutions are based on old models which are no longer adapted to the new paradigm. And every year, the day after we finish the festival, we review the content of our festival, we rediscuss the content of that festival, and we say what we did yesterday is already yesterday, it's already long gone, so we have to rediscuss what we want to do for the next year. We have to start reviewing our budgets, we have to optimize the content, we have to optimize the distribution of what we've done. So all of this is alive, so we have to change and adjust what we do permanently, like internet. Internet now means that we have to live connected 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but if you work in the cultural industry, you have to be permanently connected to the rest of the world. You have to be globalized, and the problem is our local cultural institutions don't do this. They're not aware of it. They don't want to do it, and they don't understand it. And at Sònar, I've presented the fact that we're an international brand as well, and since 2002 we've been to more than 20 different countries. We've got a festival in Japan, we've now got a festival in Reykjavik, we had a festival in Brazil, we're going to be organizing festivals in other countries, and we export our product, if you like, so we function like a private institution. So we have our festival, we have our brand, and we are cultural entrepreneurs, and this is what all of the presenters have said this afternoon. We have to constantly raise questions, and we have to constantly think about whether we couldn't do more, whether we couldn't give more, or whether we couldn't learn more and teach more, because I teach students on cultural management issues, on digital industries as well. And I'm not sure if it's because I'm more gifted than others. I'm 37 years old, but I think you have to recycle everything you do on a daily basis. This is extremely important in the cultural world, and you have to be very connected, and you have to make sure that you are aware of how culture can function economically speaking as well, because
très avantagé parce qu'on vit dans un monde dans lequel il y a vachement plus de façons de trouver
advantages nowadays, because we live in a world where it's easy to find more financial solutions. We live in a globalized world. We don't have to stay in our country and just knock on doors in our village and ask people for money, or ask people to look for private funding. Now you can go and look for private funding from outside your country. So globalization has been quite positive and has given us more resources. So there are sources of funding for cultural activities, and this is very important for us, because if we move away from this nationalistic view of culture, I think it's extremely important to do this, to move away from this nationalistic point of view of culture. So culture is universal, and I think we have to remember this in everything we do, and culture shouldn't be closed into a country and saying, I just produce culture for my country. For example, I produce a French festival for French artists. No, now we have to be universal, because culture is not hyperlocal. Okay, there is a hyperlocal phenomenon which exists, but this has to be offset with globalization. And I think we have to strike the right balance between hyperlocal activities and supporting local artists and local culture, which is produced locally, but at the same time, it's important to mix this local culture with the eclectic culture which comes from the rest of the world, which is eternal and universal. Thank you.
Alors,
We've talked about a lot of things this afternoon, and I would now like to hand over to the public in the room. So the audience has the floor. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left. Do you have any questions in the audience? No. Everybody must agree with everything you said, then, if there are no questions. Well, I'll repeat your question if you don't have a mic, because we need, specifically for the translation, we need a microphone.
Es-tu optimiste?
Alors en fait, je pense que vous posez les questions absolument essentielles.
The questions you've raised are absolutely fundamental.
Et sans doute dans les plus compliqués à répondre.
And they're probably very difficult to answer. It's true that France has developed an economic model, or a very specific cultural model at least, which I think is very interesting and very fortunate, and has enabled us to equip ourselves with facilities and to train a whole series of different artists. Sorry, the question was how difficult it is for people who are starting out, because the cultural industry seemed to be rather closed.
Oui, donc en fait, effectivement, on était.
Yes, France has constructed a cultural model which is specific to France and which is largely based on public authorities and public powers. So this has led to densification of the territory, densification of the number of stakeholders involved in the cultural scene, but it's highly subsidized as well, and public authorities have an important role to play and play a large role in culture. So this was in the past the dominant model, but it's no longer the only model. So it's not only due to the scarcity of public subsidies and the fact that the public authorities are on the verge of a crisis, which means that we're going to have to change our model. But we have to balance things out, and we've always had purely private stakeholders who've lived side by side with public stakeholders. So for the Gaîté Lyrique building that we were talking about before, it has a budget of 10 million euros. Now, if this was managed directly by the public authorities, it would probably come from the territorial authorities which decided to build this building. Now, in our case, the city of Paris injects half of its budget, 5 million euros for the facility, and then the rest comes from other sources of funding, for example, ticketing, sponsoring, patronage, a lot of revenues linked to merchandising, related to La Gaîté Lyrique, which is the digital cultural centre I was talking about. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future, and I don't know what the cultural economy will be like in the future, but it's true that there are going to be a whole series of other business models. So there might be a lot of public service delegations, but in addition to that, I think, because obviously we're moving into a digital era now, there might be other sources of funding, and there's so many sources of funding, and I think we're going to end up with some very different organizations in the future. So what I'm suggesting, or what I would tend to say, that a company is one of the interesting models to do this. So you said something else as well, which appears to be rather important in our case, which is how these young people who have ideas, who have their own desires, how we support these young people so that these ideas can come to fruition and so that they can actually start up a company on the basis of these ideas. Now, I think this is part of what we're going to recommend in the framework of the mission for the Ministry of Culture. We have to think about the different tools, such as business incubation, different instruments, financial instruments, for example, financial guarantees, bank guarantees, sureties. We're going to have to use all of these different instruments to make sure that these young people can set up their startup companies and so that they can try and develop their ideas. But unfortunately, even in the cultural world, the world is a very violent one, and not everybody will succeed. The world is a jungle, don't forget. Any other questions? Yes, I have two questions, and I would like to ask Julien Catal for an explanation. I'd like to ask you whether Trebendo was a public service delegation, and I have two questions for Stephen Hearn and Julien Catal. This public service delegation, I imagine, is based on specifications, and if this is the case, what aspects of these specifications were particularly challenging? No, in our case, it was not a public service delegation. It was a call for tenders. Well, in fact, it was a concession deal for the Trebendo for 8 years. So, and yes, there were specifications that we had to comply with. We had to develop current and emerging music, things like that, and a certain number of deadline dates, concert dates per year. I think it's 200 concerts per year. That was part of the specifications as well. And there were specifications on the pricing, ticketing price. So it was more artistic specifications, really, as well. So saying that it shouldn't be a concert hall, which would be for variety music, for example, but it should be more current music, if you like, or more modern music. Any other questions? Yeah. For us, the specifications were a lot denser than for the Trebendo, because it's true the Trebendo is an example of a balance between the business model and what we might call public service, but there wasn't any public service before Trebendo. And for the Gaîté Lyrique digital centre, so we had to have current music and digital arts. That was the main specification, and we interpreted this as follows. So we had to think about what creation is in the light of the digital era and the light of new technologies, because at the end of the day, digital technologies are not an end, but a means of doing things. So this is how we interpreted this first aspect of the specifications, which were more artistic. And then the second thing we had to do was to develop training and also have particularly low entrance prices, but also we had to pay specific attention to target audiences such as welcoming the disabled, the elderly, and also we were to organize a resources center which had to be free of charge, so which would work like a little media library. Also, we had to organize certain workshops like Fab Labs and conferences free of charge. So in the €5 million budget that I talked about, which was injected by the city, a lot of this was taken up by building maintenance, which was very costly, because it's a building which is very costly, and a large part of the city budget was devoted to maintenance and upkeep of the building, and the other part of that budget is devoted to the cultural offer as such. We have to make sure that entrance is free of charge for certain services or certain activities, and it's important to discuss issues with the city. For example, what did the city mean by public service? And we had to go into detail with them as to what they meant by access for the disabled, access for the underprivileged as well. And the city of Paris thought it could have a dedicated facility in the heart of the 3rd district of Paris for the population of the 3rd district. But we explained to them that this would be discriminatory, and we had to enlarge access to people from outside the 3rd district and maybe from even outside of Paris. So these are the type of things that they deal with in the specifications. Any other questions?
Oui, je crois que c'est ouvert. Vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me?
C'est une question
I have
sous forme de remarque
a comment
Steven et Julien.
for Stephen and
Vous avez
Julian.
particulièrement insisté
You
sur les
stressed
salariés,
the fact that you work with employees who are salaried employees on open-ended contracts. Do you think that being a company changes the way you manage things? And if yes, is there anything that we could reproduce in voluntary associations rather than corporate companies, if you like? Do you understand my question? Well, I don't really know how to answer that question.
Moi, ce que je voulais dire, en fait, en tout cas par la question
when I was talking about open-ended contracts, it's because we wanted a sustainable human resources policy. We wanted to work with people that would be gratified and fulfilled and would develop in our companies. Because when people develop themselves and develop their skills in a company, then at the end of the day, we can do some great things. But if we have all of these precarious employees and fixed-term contracts, you spend 6 months training a trainee who then leaves to go elsewhere. And sometimes we have temporary contracts for people, and then we can't keep them afterwards, and then they leave to go elsewhere. So we want to capitalize on our human resources. That's what I meant. And as cultural engineering itself is one way of taking information, transforming information, and then selling that information. If you enrich that information, and for example, if we're thinking about a new cultural policy or a new cultural facility, it's important to do that with people who have a lot of experience and who capitalize on their previous ideas and their previous experience. So that's why I was saying it's important to work with people on open-ended contracts, because there's less turnover. Now, also, voluntary associations, nonetheless, they're a kind of disguised company, but they don't think necessarily in the same way as companies do, and their business model is constructed differently, because obviously these voluntary associations tend to be subsidized, so they don't necessarily think about how to fund themselves, and the way they work is they try and have a balanced budget, and they limit the financial approach to their budgeting, and they don't really care if they make a loss because they are subsidized. So I'm not sure if there are so many common points between companies and voluntary associations, but we do need these voluntary associations, and I think it's important for them to develop in their sector, but then in another sector we have private companies. So I don't think that voluntary associations should try and copy companies and vice versa, and I think both have their place. I don't want these companies to kill off voluntary associations. I want voluntary associations to continue to exist, because a lot of artistic creation, a lot of theatre requires this form of funding and this form of organization, but there are other entities which have to do a job differently, and in the Troisième Pôle, okay, we do have public subsidies as well. But we see certain voluntary associations that have been in the field for maybe 30 years, and they've been receiving public funding for 30 years, and they've never been assessed, they've never been audited, and I think that shows us a problem. So we do have to think about how our public money is spent, how our public money is allocated as well. But it's very difficult to answer your question. I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I do think voluntary associations have their place, but also companies should act as companies. Julian, you wanted to add something, didn't you?
Juste par rapport à
yes,
le fait
in relation
pour le
to
festival, en fait, on aurait
our
pu,
festival, for our festival, we could have created this type of setup with a voluntary association or a non-profit association with volunteers here, there and everywhere, and we could have requested subsidies, but it requires a lot of work for not much result to do that. And we wanted to do something which was more professional, and we wanted everybody to be paid and to be declared as festival employees, and this really makes us a lot more professional, I think, rather than a festival which is based on work with volunteers. Now, as an agency myself, I've seen a lot of festivals full of volunteers, and it's true there are volunteers everywhere, all over the place, who are serving beer, who have to take a couple to the hotel, but they don't know where the hotel is. Sometimes it's not really very professional when working with volunteers, and we wanted a very professional festival with a more elegant appearance, if you like, or more professional. We wanted to look more professional for the public, and people have criticized us because our entrance prices are quite high, but we shouldn't forget that we've got 200 employees who live off that. And I think the fact of having declared employees is classier, if you like, or more elegant. So this is the organisation we opted for, and this means we have to pay people, and we have to pay them well to do their job properly. It was a deliberate choice on our part. And we have worked without volunteers for more than 12 years, because we can't really survive just working with volunteers. And we wanted to professionalise our festival as well. So this is why we don't work with volunteers. And we pay everybody who works for us. So we work above all with trainees who are paid for by universities. So this is a formula which tends to work and which is used a lot in Europe, but it works well.
Marketing media.
So I'm head of digital communication and marketing media, and but for example, Instagram and a lot of groups like that use trainees and people from universities, and I think it's a good thing to pay people rather than using volunteers.
Peut-être compléter quelque chose, mais c'est pour toi, Julie, en fait, mais c'est vrai que le travail que tu fais qui est remarquable.
The work that you do is remarkable. It's very professional, but this doesn't mean
que certaines associations ne font pas un travail tout aussi
these
professionnel.
voluntary associations don't do a professional job as well. What I'm more surprised by is how you make sure that Pitchfork Festival doesn't depend on anyone else apart from you, whereas in fact you have other festivals which have a similar approach, and the budget tends to be subsidized by the city or the region. So there must be some business models that differ in different places, and I don't know, maybe Julien, you could contact other local authorities and see how they show them how you work. But there are other areas which are cultural deserts as well, and in Paris, it's a very captive population compared to Pitchfork. Maybe for your festival it's more difficult, I don't know. But the voluntary associations and the world of business, I don't think they're mutually opposed. The two have their specific features, and they do have their place. And I think we have to think about self-funded business models for both, for companies and for the voluntary associations. I think we have to be more creative about how we work. And we have to be more creative than just creating concerts or festivals. Maybe one final question, and then we have to close. Yeah, I wanted to come back to what you've just said in relation to the difference between a company and a voluntary association. Now, I manage an association which has been organising concerts and digital events for many years. We don't have much in the way of subsidies, so the way I work is a little like a company. In fact, I have the same level of requirement. I have to pay my employees, I have to pay the artists, I have to pay everybody that works for us, and the difference is that I have more flexibility in terms of charges and taxes, etc. But now I was thinking about what you were saying earlier on and what you've just said about when you're talking about the specific field that companies work in and the specific fields that voluntary associations work in. But what room does this give for experimentation, artistic experimentation? not working on only bankable projects, but projects which will help us enable more innovative projects to emerge, if you like.
Il me semble avoir répondu justement.
Well, I think I've answered that question, haven't I?
C'est pour ça que je disais qu'effectivement,
This is why I was
une
saying
part en tout cas importante de la puissance publique et de la subvention devait
a
servir
lot of
à des
public
formes
money
plus
should be
exigeantes de la
used
création,
for
en tout cas,
more
donc,
demanding
ce
forms
volet-là.
of creation.
Après, par contre, est-ce qu'on doit le répartir entre
But should this
les associations
be
et
distributed
l'entreprise?
between
Enfin,
voluntary
je crois pas
associations and
qu'une-
companies? I don't know.
je crois pas qu'une
I
entreprise
don't
soit
think that a
nécessairement
company is
moins
necessarily
innovante ou
less
moins créative
innovative
qu'une
or
association.
less creative than a voluntary
Je pense que
association.
les associations,
I
c'est
think
enfin, c'est une
voluntary
organisation
associations are
effectivement qui est née en 1901,
associations
qui a
which
toute
are
une
governed
histoire,
by a French law which dates back to 1901.
reflète
So
une
they're
manière de
non-profit
faire,
associations.
Et comme effectivement en France,
And
la
we have a
culture
strong
était
culture of these
souvent
non-profit
publique,
associations
d'ailleurs un peu
in
comme,
France,
les
which are
politiques
based on
sociales.
public funding,
On a
like
trouvé
social
effectivement une
policy
souplesse dans
is.
les associations,
So this
c'est
gives us
facile,
more
c'est facile, c'était une
flexibility,
manière pour l'État de donner par
this
rapport à
is
la
one
subvention,
way of
faisait
the
un peu
state
d'ailleurs une délégation de service public
allowing
au fond.
these associations to manage their services. It's like a public service delegation because they're more flexible.
En tout cas, je ferais pas le. Enfin, si c'était ça, je
But
dirais pas forcément que les
I
associations.
wouldn't necessarily say that voluntary associations are more creative than companies and businesses. I think there are some businesses today, such as la Gaîté, Lyrique, which develop forms of art which are completely cutting edge and innovative.
C'est bien répondu ou pas, non?
Does this answer your question or not? I'm not sure it does actually, but anyway. Well, anyway, I think we have to stop there, and I'd just like to thank our speakers. Thank you, Stephen, Todd, Julian, and Georgia. I think they deserve a round of applause.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.